Okay, you like to continue with the price model. Price model is not so well known, and you may ask yourself, so you may well ask what price model, because we said all prices were equal to one. That's how we chose the units of measurement. So that remains all prices, the actual prices are all equal to one. So what we're going to talk about now are equilibrium prices. So the equilibrium prices, the definition of equilibrium is that for each and every industry chain, we have that the revenues equal the costs. And because all prices, actual prices, are equal to one, there cannot be confusion. So we use the same letters as we used before, but we use them now to indicate equilibrium prices. So in the input-output table, the xj indicates the number of physical units, each of which originally cost $1. Now something changes, and every unit, physical unit that used to cost $1 now costs something else, namely PJ. So if every unit now costs PJ, then the total amount, the total value that comes here is PJ times XJ. We have here the revenues, PJ times XJ, and we must also calculate the cost. So this is the amount of labor. It used to cost $1 for every physical unit, and now it costs W. So the costs here are, labor costs are W times LK. And the cost for capital are R times KJ. But for intermediate inputs, we have here intermediate input of type I. It used to cost $1 per physical unit, and that now becomes PI. So the value of the intermediate deliveries, the costs of intermediate deliveries are PI times ZID. That is okay. And again, for the ZID, we're going to substitute the using the proportionality assumption that we made, and observe that we now have xj everywhere, so we leave out the xj. And then we have the price equals the cost of intermediate inputs equals plus the labor cost plus the capital cost. So for 1 unit. So that looks like already like a price model. So this is for product J. You can write that nicely for all products. And then we have here the A matrix and a very small vector O, very small vector WR, and the B matrix. So written even shorter, row vector with prices, P prime times A plus the minimal vector WR times the B matrix. And the solution is moving this part to the other side and multiplying with the Leonchev inverse, and you get the model, the price model. The prices are given as WR times B times M. Now let's take an example. This is an example that is usually pretty confusing for my own students. I tell them, well, let's take an easy example. Let's take W and R equals 1. And then you run the calculation here, and you see 1 times PM, 1. That's the moment where students get confused, because the outcome is that the prices are 1 and 1. And then the obvious question is, are you surprised? Are you surprised? No. Why not? You shouldn't be surprised. But why not?
You're adding up the total cost. I mean, the bidding and that's what the primary.
Yeah.
Okay? So it's 1 for each.
Yeah. So this is a very silly question. We were already in an equilibrium.
Yes.
Oh. Look here. If we do this for this table, where the numbers come from, well, it is already an equilibrium where costs equal the revenues. So there is nothing to change. So question is this a silly model? No, this is not a silly model. This was a very silly exercise. This was a very stupid question. So this is what we should not do. And so the next question is now suppose keep the numbers easy and manageable. Suppose that workers get 50% extra wages and salaries. So in that case, W becomes 1.5, and this becomes 0.78 plus 0.48 is 1.26, and here we have 0.45 plus 0.7 is 1.50. And note that these outcomes are price indexes, because the original price was 1, and now the new price is 1.26. Means that the new price is 26% larger than the old price. So these are these are price indexes. And if you want to, if you like, you can calculate a new input output table. The price of labor became 50% higher. So this becomes 90, 15, and 105. We multiply the first row because prices become 26% larger. Second row multiplied by 1.15 because prices are increased by 15%. Nothing changes in the R with the capital. So then you arrive at this input output table. And the question, of course, is are these numbers, do they match? And if you've done the exercise correctly, then they do match. And of course, in this case, they do. Okay, let's talk about the assumptions that we have made, and in particular, the assumptions that we have implicitly made and that I've not told you about, and I'll tell you now. So one of the assumptions is, input output is fantastic. Input output is great. I've been working now for 40 years on input output, and probably they will want to retire me in 1 or 2 years, but I will continue hopefully the next 20 years with input output. And that's a lot of things to do. But we should realize that input output is not sacred. It also has its shortcomings, and we should be realistic about also the shortcomings. And for some questions, you should use input output because it's almost perfect. But for some other questions, you should not. You should be very careful in using input output. And let's be honest about this. So one of the assumptions is, and recall the exercises that I gave. You give me the final demand factor, you tell me what you want to eat next year, and I can calculate the new outputs, and I can calculate how much labor and capital you need for that. Well, the question is there so much labor and is there so much capital? In many markets, at least in Europe, there are tensions and we don't have enough labor anymore. So in that case, there could be problems, there could be restrictions. Now, if that occurs, the simple input-output model can tell you how much labor is required, but not what to do if the labor is not there. So if you want to tackle questions in that area, you could implement or combine input-output tables with, or input-output techniques with, for example, linear or nonlinear programming techniques. Other issues that are usually brought up, the assumptions in, in the exercise, give me no final demand, assume the input coefficients are fixed, remain the same, and I can calculate new outputs and a new labor and capital. So the assumption there is fixed input coefficients. Are input coefficients fixed? No, never. They change from year to year. But the question is, which country are you doing this for? There has been a lot of research in the past on the fixity of the input coefficients. And what we observed is that for, let's say, Western countries, the input coefficients develop very, very slowly. They remain constant or the development is very slow. So if you then look at a period of 5 years apart, you don't lose too much. However, I've been working quite a bit with China, and there at a certain stage, you saw that the input coefficients in China changed radically from 1 year to another year, because they were building up their production structure, and structural changes lead to large input coefficients. So if the country that you are working with is a country with huge structural changes, well, this could be a problem. If you're working with a very boring West European or United States West European country, or the boring United States or Canada, I mean, nothing going on. One of the, for me, is the crucial points is we thought a quantity model assumes that prices are fixed. With the price model, the implicit assumption is that the quantity remain fixed as they are. So there is a strict dichotomy. We have prices and we have quantity, and they do not respond to each other. Now, for some questions, that is okay. That is sort of okay. But for some other questions, it's not okay. So, for example, if you are interested in analyzing the effects of a new tax, or an increase in the tax, very often you have something in mind. You want to change a tax, and therefore, with the change in tax, actually, you want to influence the behavior of consumers or behavior of producers. Now, that is not included, because with a tax, I can calculate how the prices will respond, but I cannot tell you what consumers will do in response to price increases. So tax exercises are very often aimed at changing behavior. And so price changes will have an effect on quantity changes. And that is not included in the input-output model. So if that is what you want to do, perhaps you should use a different type of model. And vice versa, also quantities do have an effect on prices. And finally, of course, scale effects and substitution effects. I mean, substitution is a thing of economists, but in all honesty, sometimes substitution at a national level is very, very limited. Substitution takes place also in these input-output tables, but if you look at the input-output tables and their development over time, you see relatively little substitution. I mean, even the introduction of computers, Nobel Prize winner Solow said you can see them everywhere, but in the statistics, not in the statistics. And that is also what we saw in input output tables. Where was the computer revolution? So now these are all issues. And you can apply econometrics. Econometric input-output models have been built. They are models just like the models that we have done here. But for example, the A coefficients are estimated, not by C by J divided by XJ. No, there is a price component involved, for example, to make price dependent. And we have CGP models that in particular have sort of a solution on the issue of dirt cost. So use input output analysis is my invitation, but use it wisely and not blindly on each and every thing. Last part, oh no, this is something that for a very long time input output analysis was not very popular, and people said to Leontev, well, this is not economics that you're doing. This is basically engineering economics, and it's about technical aspect of production, and it's not so much about economic behavior. And actually that is true. And for some questions, that is not even so bad. Recall that I told you I started this presentation, this practical, with a cow and a kilogram of beef, 15,500 liters. A kilogram of pork is only 5,000 liters. And you could say, well, who cares? Meat is meat. That's true. I mean, I like pork as much as I like beef, but not in terms of water. So there's a factor 3. This is 300%. How much do you think is the substitution elasticity between beef and pork? Probably if it's big, it's 10%, it's 20, 30%, and huge, but not 300%. So focusing on, as many economists do, on economic behavior only means that you throw away the baby with the bathwater. So for a question that involves beef and pork, my suggestion would be forget about the economic behavior and focus on these numbers. Because very often, I mean, best of both worlds would be to combine them into one big model, but that typically is too much. So one extension that I would like to mention here is the closure of the model. So the working on the standard input-output model, as we have seen now so far, is suppose the exports increase. If the exports increase of a country, the production goes up, the wage payments go up. But what are you going to do with the extra wages? And the current model, nothing. Consumption is fixed. And that is a bit strange, isn't it? So you would expect that if the wages go up, you're going to spend something of the extra wages. So you would expect, this is what we have, exports go up, production goes up, wage payment goes up, and then it stops. You would expect that in real life, exports go up, production go up, wage payments go up, and then therefore the consumption goes up. But if the consumption goes up, then production goes up, and we keep on circling around. That is what you would expect. Now that can be explained with a social accounting matrix. This is a very simple social accounting matrix. We have a number of institutions. We have production sectors. We have workers, factors of production. We have households, and we have other companies. And the social accounting matrix, in the row, it gives how you get your money, the institution. In the column, it tells you how you spend your money, or the payments of money. So agriculture produces for 600, or the income receipts of money are 600, and that is by selling their products to agriculture itself, manufacturing, rural households, urban households, and exports. And that's how they get their money. How do they spend their money? They buy inputs, manufacturing from services. They buy labor, farm labor and color labor, and they have imports. Same for the next set. These are the workers, the color workers, blue collar workers. There's a few of them in administration on the farms. A lot of them work in manufacturing and in services. And that's it. That's how they earn their money. How do they spend their money? Well, they don't spend the money themselves, because a worker is a worker, and the money is spent by households. So they give the money to urban households and rural households. Most of the workers here, color workers, live in urban areas, and few live in rural areas. The next step is what are these urban households are going to do. The urban households, they received 570 from the color workers, and what are they going to do? They're going to buy products, final products, and they're going to spend some money, give some money, a transfer of money from urban households to rural households. So these are income transfers, and of course they buy some imports. So I have here, and that is what makes a social accounting matrix much more rich than an input-output table. An input-output table has roughly this part, and of course the final demands. But here is where the income is generated. Here it's distributed. The income is distributed to households, and here it's redistributed. So for a lot of political questions, in particular, these two parts are very important. The distribution and redistribution of income. So the working of the model is, suppose the exports go up, then we have through the input-output part to produce more. In that case, the workers earn more. In that case, the households receive more income through distribution and through redistribution, and therefore they spend more money on extra consumption, and then it turns around. So this is what happens. It starts turning around. Still, you can run your calculations. Now, instead of a simple 3x3 A matrix, we now have this part as a 7x7 sort of A matrix, and we only have the exports in this example exogenous. A very simple exercise: increase the export of agriculture by 1, then the first column of the matrix M gives the results. So these are the increases in production in agriculture, manufacturing services, extra earnings by farm workers, color workers, extra income by rural and urban households. I could have done the same calculation with the input-output model and observe the huge differences. And the huge differences are just here pedagogically. Is I created this example. So I completely fucked up this economy. How? Because what I've done is in creating this example, there is little, it keeps on turning around. And if it keeps on turning around a lot, that is exactly the difference between a SAM model and an IO model. So it keeps turning around a lot if there is no leakage. The leakage is here. Observe, the leakage is divided by 600. This is hardly anything and hardly any leakage. So because it does not leak out, it keeps on turning around and around. And that creates why this is why the numbers are so different. In real life cases, the numbers are very close or are more close to each other, but still. It indicates you missed some. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for your attention for the first part. Which means that you have to help me now to get into the second. That's 1B. Thank you. We have discussed national input-output tables. I'm now going to give a couple of applications for using national input-output tables. Tomorrow, I'm going to use the global input-output tables. First one is this is something. Some students claim that input-output is very technical, very difficult, it's terrible. This is what I show students even in high school. I have used this in high school to tell people what input-output is. And sometimes it's frightening. So I'm going to calculate the emissions that are embodied in exports, because that is something they understand. So I give them the simplest input-output table that exists to industries. I tell them what is in the input-output table. And then I ask the question, who wants to produce 600 and 500? How much do you need if you produce only one? Well, then immediately they say, oh, yeah, it's easy. You divide this by 600 and divide that by 500. So without mentioning the name input coefficients or whatever, they come up with these. And I tell them, okay, but who wants to produce one of agriculture and manufacturing and one of services? Nobody. No, nobody. Now, what do you want to produce? I don't know. Well, I don't know either. So let's call them XA and XS. Great. So if that is XA and XS, these are the inputs and primary inputs that you use. And this is what we had. And now I go back to the question that has disappeared on my slide. So the next question is, okay, I asked how much emissions are in the exports. So actually, I'm interested only how much production, how much emissions are all in this vector. Now, that's easy peasy, isn't it? And now, some of these students, these kids, 16, 17-year-old, they get nervous. And they even get more nervous if I show them, well, actually, this is two equations with two unknown variables, right? And you have learned in your second grade how to solve them. And then you see that they start sweating. But this is basically what it is. And I don't let them sweat too long. I give them immediately the answer. And the answer is irrelevant. It's 176 and 144. And the next question is, because we want to go to the emissions, I asked them, I think I asked them first, how much imports go into these exports? Well, if you produce this, then that much is produced by A&M, 17.6, and that much is produced by, is imported by services. That is 7.2. So the imports are $24.8 if this table is in dollars, or $120 of export. So if you translate that into per $1,000 of export, that is $207 per $1,000 of export. And the numbers are completely irrelevant. But this is the famous measure that was introduced in 2001 in the Journal of International Economics for how much is GDP. And this is the measure that has been used by everybody ever after. And you see, you can do that in 4 or 5 slides, even at high school level. The other question is how much domestic value added goes into these exports. And that is 0.5 times 176, and again, 0.05 times 144. And that's 95 something. And these are the famous value added exports. So these are the domestic value added that ends abroad on a plate. And this was proposed in 2012 by Johnson and Noguera in the Journal of International Economics. And yeah. Oh yeah. And then I have to answer my own question. So if you have additional information on the emissions, then you can calculate emission coefficient. So we have 360 tons for 600 million euros in, apparently I've changed into euros overnight. So that would be 1.6 ton per million euros, and the same in services. So in that case, the emissions embodied in the exports, you do 0.6 times 176 and 0.2 times 144. And that is basically what we're going to do. So the first application, I'm only going to show you applications that I did myself or where I was involved. So this one is was published in 2007, and we're talking about virtual water trade by Andalusia. This is where Andalusia is. So this is Spain. And Andalusia is the most southern region. Sevilla is approximately here. And the problem with this region is it's very dry. It's a very arid region. And it's even more problematic because a lot of water comes from underground reservoirs. And a lot of these underground reservoirs are here relatively close to the coast. Which means that if you take water out of these reservoirs, the reservoirs fill with seawater. So after a while, the salinity of the underground reservoirs increases, which means that after some time, you may not be able to use these underground reservoirs anymore. So it's a very threatening situation. It turns out that 90% approximately of all water consumption is in agriculture. And well, I could live without lemons, I could live without beans, I could even live without sheep. But of course, this use of water is very important. It's very essential. These are the numbers. Let me explain. So the data were for, we had the input-output tables for Spain, and it included Andalusia and the rest of Spain. It was for 1990. And here we have the column with direct water. And direct water is the liters of water used per euro of production. So, for example, the vegetables and fruit is not so water intensive. For 1 euro of production, that in 1990 was 683 liters. But observe that citrus fruits are very, very, very lemons, oranges that are grown in Andalusia are very, very water intensive. A lot of the manufacturing industries are not very intensive, water intensive. Food processing, hardly any water is involved. Services, hardly any water is involved. A little bit hotels and catering. And the problem is these tourists, they all want to take a shower every day. It's the use of that. Virtual water is the water, liters of water per euro of domestic consumption of vegetables. This means the amount of water that is included in the oranges as you buy them in the shops. That's the final product. And observe for citrus fruits, for vegetables, and most of the cereals and legumes, it's more or less the same. Observe the huge difference between direct water and virtual water in food processing. Because food processing basically is processing food, and the food comes from here. So a lot of water is not directly in the industry, but is in the products that they are processing. And that is taken into account here. And same here. So this is basically the showers. This is basically the restaurant and hotels, the food. The large differences, not here, but large differences between direct and vertical. Now let's have a look at the top part of the table. So it's domestic consumption, consumption by Andalusian consumers, by other Spanish consumers, and by foreign consumers or producers. And all the final demands are set at 100. So we're talking here about percentages. And observe that 7.5% of all the final demands are exported. So 92%, the large amount of 92% is kept for domestic consumers. Observe also that agriculture has only 6% of all the final demands, food processing 11%, and 83% is in other industries. We do the same with the virtual water consumption. So the total is 100% again, and observe the differences. Observe that agriculture and food processing, they are good for 17% of the final demands, the final products. But these 17%, they are responsible for 83% of the water use. exports of agriculture and food processing is good for 3% of the final products. But this 3%, 2.9%, is responsible for more than 16% of the water, virtual water in Andalusia. So the question is, what do you want to do if water is such a serious problem in Andalusia? And well, our suggestion was we leave this at this moment, we leave it to the politicians. But I also mentioned that if I remember well, it was in Jordan. They have done the same exercise. They decided to stop the export of citrus fruits. The citrus fruits are very, very water intensive. And they say, well, we don't have the water. And it's ridiculous that we are exporting water from our arid, dry region to the Netherlands, where they have water up to here. I mean, yeah. The only problem is we don't have sunshine. Okay. So it is something to take into consideration whether you want to do something here. And of course, if you do that, if you stop exporting agricultural and food processing products, of course, that your GDP will decrease, of course, and it will harm certain labor. Certain workers will become unemployed. So we did also the calculation there, and the numbers are in the original paper. So that is a point for, okay, what is more important? That typically is something that well, we left to the politicians. Next exercise. Do we want a short break? A very short break? I mean, 10 minutes or so to go to the toilets or to do or whatever. Yeah, 10 minutes?
Bueno, pues that's chica. Aquí ya ves, veniendo mucho. ¿Qué tal? También, mucho trabajo. Hoy vale la pena salir. ¿Vas a venir los ejercicios? No creo. Yo creo que el resto los voy a ver. Yo pedí el día también para poder. Ok, también no voy a tener que echarme, pero que no me
So in this paper, we're going to look at the pollution haven hypothesis. And the question is India a pollution haven? Also, this paper is pretty old. It's was published in 2007 in Environmental Resource Economics. You have to help me, please. The idea of the pollution haven is that, and in particular in the time that we're talking about, and so that is early 2000s, rich countries, they often have strict regulations, environmental regulations, and therefore they relocate production really literally abroad, or they buy dirty products from abroad. So they say, you produce the dirty products and I import from you, and I export clean products to you. And in that case, I, rich country, am the champion of the environmental regulations, and I am the champion of the Kyoto Protocol. So rich countries export clean products and import dirty products, poor countries, vice versa, export the dirty products and import the products that they would produce cleanly. Now, the idea was India is certainly at that stage was a poor country. So if we increase the trade with and from India, then the expectation is that the exports increase. So therefore, there will be more emissions by India, and India imports. So therefore, there will be less emissions in India because they import. But we think that according to the pollution haven hypothesis, the first effect, exporting dirty products, first effect is larger than the second effect, because they import from richer countries. So the idea is that India imports more than it exports. So we calculate here the change in emissions due to extra exports and extra imports. So the trade balance is balanced, doesn't change, and we increase import and export both by 1 billion rupees. This is has nothing to do with India. Just an example that I use for my students, and it's just about the numbers. So the exports are in yellow, imports are in red. They are, in this case, in million rupees. Now, if India increases its exports by 1 billion rupees, and we take the average export bundle. So if we divide these numbers by the total here, that's 62,900, then we have 6,400 divided by 63,000 is so much, and these numbers add up to 1,000. So these are the shares. And the thousands times thousand million rupees is exactly 1 billion rupees. So this is how the exports are increased if they are increased by 1 billion. And we do the same with the imports. The total imports by India is 132,000. So divide each of these numbers by 132,000, and you have the import shares. And if you let them add up to 1,000, you have the amounts in million rupees that add up to 1 billion rupees of extra imports. Now, these are the factors that you use and you multiply them with emission multipliers. Multipliers, see the last hour, multipliers give you the increase in emissions or 1 extra million rupees, for example, of exports in this industry. Multiply these numbers with the emission multipliers. And here are the results. Observe that India has a slightly different calendar than we have. So the administrative year stops in March or in April. So we do not know what it is, whether it's 1981 partly and partly 1982. That's what the data are for. Observe that the exports of the export bundle, 1 billion rupees extra exports, at 125,000 extra tons of CO2. If the imports in India had gone up, its emissions would have gone down because they don't have to produce certain products no longer at home. They import them, and then their emissions would have gone down by 245,000 tons of CO2. Now that is a serious message. The imports of India contain, or the products that they import, if they had produced them at home, it would have been much more emissions than the export. So India is producing clean products and importing dirty products. Observe that the ratio is 125 divided by 245 is 0.51. Observe also that the results are the same for SO2 and NOx. Doesn't matter very much what pollutant you consider. Observe also that this ratio, exports divided by imports, even decreases. So here, India exports clean products, imports dirty products, and the difference even gets larger. So the conclusion is, our conclusion is that India was not a pollution haven in 1991, and even lesser so in 1996. 1996 itself. So it even gets further away from being a pollution. This is what you observe also for other countries. The empirical results for pollution havens are very, very mixed. Pollution haven effect can be found, in particular at the level of establishments and certain firms, but not at the level of countries very often. The last three papers, the last three applications are all about China, about outsourcing in China. I'm going to look at vertical specialization and trade in emissions and at national income. So what about outsourcing, processing, trade, international fragmentation? There are lots of fancy terms for that, offshoring. Let's have a look at the example of notebooks. So consider a notebook that is completely made in the US. It contains memory chips and LCD panels. You throw it in a box of accessories. You have somebody with a screwdriver to assemble the notebook. And then the notebook goes to wholesale and retail trade, and then it ends with consumers. That's the process roughly of an American notebook. Now, this is what at a certain stage happened. They said, okay, the box with accessories, we send it to China. We have some Chinese labor playing with a screwdriver, and they send the notebook immediately back to the US, where it goes into the wholesale trade. Now, this involves Chinese imports related to outsourcing or processing trade, and Chinese exports sending back the product. Now, what is so typical about processing trade for international fragmentation, outsourcing? And typically, it takes some cheap labor. It's basically playing with the screwdriver, assembly work, and then immediately it goes back. And a lot of imported intermediate inputs. While they work with a screwdriver is not extremely well paid. So for the country, China in this case, it adds very little value added. So it helps them a little bit in terms of their GDP, but not extremely much. Also, also playing with a screwdriver, there's hardly any emissions involved. So also it involves relatively little emissions. Now this production process is completely different from an ordinary production process in China. So therefore, the idea is that we should treat these exports and imports, but in particular the exports related to processing trade, different than other exports. And in particular, and that is what China makes so special, 55% of exports at a certain stage around 2002 were related to processing trade. So of all the trade, only 45% was ordinary exports. The rest was processing trade. So this is a paper about the biases in the measurement of vertical specialization from 2015. So the summary of the whole paper is that we use the measure for vertical specialization that I showed you in the example for high school students' kids. That is what we're going to use. And given the importance of China's processing trades that I just mentioned, 55%, you would expect that China has a high score on vertical specialization. So you would expect that China has much import in its export, because that is the measure that we will use for vertical specialization. Import content of the export. Well, China, basically you fly in the imports, play with the screwdriver, send out the exports again. So you would expect a high import content of the exports. Now we do the numbers. Show you the numbers in a minute, and we find that not much vertical specialization is measured for China. So we have a problem. Is the theory wrong? Is the measure wrong? Or are the data wrong? And the answer will be the data wrong. So this is the again, vertical specialization, the global value chain. We're going to look at the imports that go into the exports. And again, we take a notebook produced or assembled in China. It's exported to the US, and it includes, for example, some memory chips from Korea in this example. In the US, well, it sells to wholesale and retail trade. They sell it to firms and consumers. Of course, the Chinese production process includes other intermediate inputs. It includes some labor and capital. In China, some of these notebooks are sold also to its own consumers and to Chinese firms. But there is one other aspect, and that is it includes Chinese LCD panels in this example. And the Chinese LCD panels use imported accumulators, electric accumulators from Korea. So now, if we look at the imported content of China's exports, we have direct and indirect imports. So these would be the direct imports that go directly into the notebooks that are directly exported. So that is one part. The indirect imports, they go into the LCD panels, and the LCD panels go into the notebooks. So this is an indirect import for these exports. Now, and if you want to have the import content of these exports, you should add the import and the green part. Recall, this is the example that I gave you for the high school kids, how much imports are included in the exports. Well, that is exactly what is calculated here. And this is exactly what we are going to calculate. But then for bigger input-output tables. Well, this is the input-output table, what it looks like. We have D for intermediate inputs, F for domestic final demand, exports and outputs. We have here an import matrix, and here the value added. Calculate the domestic input coefficients A, import coefficients, and we have the model X equals AX plus the final demand, all final demands, so domestic and foreign final demands. We have the Leonchev inverse. Now it's denoted by L. Recapitulate Lij, row I, column J, gives you the output of industry I that is necessary directly and indirectly for 1 unit on monetary terms, renminbi, for example, in China, for 1 renminbi of domestic final demand or exports, any final demand of good J. So this is the amount of production in I necessary for final demand of good J. So imports are MKI. So if Lij gives the output in industry I, then MKI times Lij tells you the imports good K that go into process industry I that is necessary for the final product J. So the imports of good K by industry I, of course, all necessary for final demand, 1 unit of final demand J. But I'm not so much interested in the import of good K only. I'm interested in all the imports. And I'm also not interested in only imports of industry I don't care which industry imports what. I want to have the import of all industries. So I take the summation of A and K. That is the summation. That is the total import multiplier. So that tells you the total amount of all imports of good 1, good 2, good K imported by industry 1, 2, or I, but that is necessary for 1 unit renminbi of domestic or exports of good J. That is mu J. Well, I'm not going to I'm not going to export 1 renminbi of good J. I'm going to export EJ, so much of good J. So that requires mu J times EJ of imports. So all exports, take the summation over J, and you have all the imports that go into all exports. That is the measure of vertical specialization. All the imports that go into the exports as a percentage, as a ratio of the exports. And that was, in the example, $207 per $1,000 of exports. So we did a calculation for China. We had an input-output table with 27 industries, and we found 0.28. So that's a typo, every 100 renminbi of exports require on average 28 renminbi of imports, directly and indirectly. Okay, congratulations. But the question is that much or not? So we also have made a comparison to other countries. We have took the input-output tables, the OECD tables that were available at that stage. They had 48 industries, and these were the numbers. Observe that 2002 would be somewhere between 0.20 and 25. Different tables, different classification. So it is different from 0.28, but not radically different. Both are relatively on the small side, I would say. These are the outcomes. You see, some countries have very little vertical specialization. Australia. Do you know where Australia is? Have you ever been to Australia?
Apart from what the other countries.
It's so far away from the civilized world. I mean, nobody trades with Australia. I mean, it's too far away. US, I mean, they are big, and they think they're big, and probably they're even bigger, but they don't need anyone else. So they're very self-supporting. Japan, you know, they're very self-supporting. Brazil, it's a huge country. They have almost everything in the country, also very self-supporting country. In contrast, the Netherlands, where I'm from, I mean, in the Netherlands, we have nothing. I mean, we have wooden shoes and we have tulips, and that's about it. We have cows and peas and milk, but no more than that. So we are too small. We really need other countries. We depend on other countries to stay alive. The same for a small European country like Denmark. Canada, slightly different, but they depend very, very much on the US. So there is an enormous amount of trade with the US. So you see that China in this set of results is in the medium set, and certainly not what we expected. So China is very, very average. So what about the processing trade, and in particular our expectation that China would score very high on vertical specialization? And the idea is that the message here in this paper is we cannot see the processing trade because the data do not show the processing trade properly. So ordinary production for Chinese consumers, that depends largely on domestic intermediate goods and little on imported goods. Processing trade is exactly the other way around, depends very much on imported goods and very little on domestically produced intermediate goods. The input-output table reflects the average production structure. The average production structure, there are 1.3 billion people in China. And I can tell you, they eat every day. So it's an enormous country. So the domestic consumption is enormous in comparison to the exports. So the input-output table is an average of all the different forms of production, and production for domestic market is dominant there. So basically, C is that the production related to processing trade gets a very, very small weight in the average production structure. Now, how to solve that? Well, okay, bring it out, bring it in the open. And that's what my Chinese colleagues have done. So this is what we said. We should treat the exports related to processing trade different than other exports, and in particular because processing trade is so important. So the solution is make a new input-output table with a special focus on processing trade and separate it from other production. So we now have a table here, I will show you in a minute, that distinguishes three types of production. So the first type is for domestic use only. Hardly any imports, a lot of domestic intermediate inputs. processing exports, we have discussed, that is, depends a lot on imports, partly on domestic intermediate inputs, and we have a sort of an intermediate category. And this intermediate category that has the non-processing, so ordinary export, but it also has other production of foreign invested enterprises. So what we see in China is that we have one foreign invested enterprise that imports the product, sells it to another foreign invested enterprise in China to do the next step, and they export it. So it is close to processing export, but there is one or two steps in between foreign invested enterprises. So this is an intermediate type of production. And we saw that in the results, in the tables, that was different. In China, these special input output tables were produced by a group of Chinese authors, including Lawrence Lau. And in China, it was possible because there were special regulations. The idea was that this chair and that chair are exactly the same, but underneath here it says for exports, and underneath that chair it says for domestic use only. And why? Because this chair, imports of metal and whatever, were exempted from taxes. So the tax authorities, the customs and the tax authorities, they had very, very detailed records of what comes in and what goes out, because of this exemption. Of course, everybody likes the tax exemption, and therefore, in order to prevent fraud, everything was recorded. So we were able to use these, or they were able to use these data. And this is what the input-output table looks like. We have the three categories: D, P, processing trade and processing export, and non-processing exports, the other category. And observe that the processing exports, they were allowed only to export. So they don't deliver anything at all to domestic firms. The category for domestic use only, they deliver to domestic producers, to domestic consumers, but not to exports, because that is by definition not the case. And the third category, non-processing, that is intermediate, and they are a bit of domestic final use and exports. This is what the coefficient matrices look like. This is what we saw, measure of vertical specialization. I can write this as the weighted average of the import multipliers. These are the import multipliers, and these are the weights. The weight is the exports by industry J as a share of the total exports. So I can do exactly the same. UJ with weights, and then for processing exports, for non-processing exports, here are no exports, but still I can calculate this measure. It's a bit silly to call it vertical specialization because that is defined only for export, but you can calculate the weighted average of these multipliers. That's the total, and these are the results. So this is what we had in 2002, 0.28. We did also the calculation for 2007, 0.31. But now we're going to use our spectral input-output table. And what do we see? That for the processing exports, the import content of 100 renminbi of exports is 70 renminbi of imports. So that is huge. For domestic use only, that was the production that used hardly any imports. You see, it's only 6. And that was the intermediate category. And if you take the average, the weighted average of these numbers, then you arrive at a national total of 0.45. And you see 0.45 is still quite large. We have Denmark and the Netherlands, 0.35. Now 0.45 is seriously large and certainly much larger than the 0.20. And you see something similar for 2007. Start shifting a little bit. We said that as well. We have the high degree of vertical specialization that we expected. Observe that the 0.45, it's not exactly the same because the calculation is slightly different than what I'm telling you now, but approximately it is 55% times 0.7 plus 45% times 0.22. That is approximately the 0.45 for the national average. However, for this national total in the ordinary input output table, where everything is combined, use these weights. And it turns out that, like I said, 1.3 billion consumers, while they have 82% of the final max. That is what yields the 0.28. So the vertical specialization in China is very large, but it requires a special input output table P how large it is. And the ordinary input output table yields biased results because vertical specialization will be largely underestimated. And this finding is expected to hold also for other countries, Mexico, like Indonesia, like Vietnam. And what is so special about this? These countries are large, will have a large share of final products go to the domestic consumption, domestic household. There are so many of them, and they have a large share within trade. A large share is processed. So in that case, now this paper is does more or less the same, but then adds emissions. It was in the Journal of Environmental Economics and Management. So this paper looks at emission. And these are the emissions from 91 to 2006. And you see, and it stops here because in 2006 is the first year where China emits slightly more than the US, and this divergence ever after. As a point of reference, I'm given here Germany, and as you see, Germany is an extremely boring country. It's nothing going on. It's flat as hell. At least its emission profile. So approximately 29 billion tons of CO2, gigatons of CO2 worldwide in 2050. And the US and China had approximately 6 gigatons each. Now, at that time, also, this had an effect. And this was the effect. This is, of course, Uncle Sam, but Uncle Sam represents also Western Europe, pointing fingers at you must. This is what happened. You must reduce your emissions also to China. Of course, this was the response by the Chinese people. What was their argument? They said, well, a lot of emissions, of our emissions, are in the exports to you. So don't blame us, blame yourself. And that is basically what we're going to check in this paper. So in 2002, emissions in million tons are by residents. That's basically driving a car and heating houses, etc. And the largest part is emissions in the production process, the whole producing electricity, producing cement, etc. On average, for the average country, the emissions by resident is between 10, 20, sometimes a little bit more percent. This is on the low side, but it is what it is. And in this paper, we're going to focus only on the 3.4 gigatons in the production, so not on the consumers. And the question is, how much emissions are for exports? Well, this is what we've seen before for the on the previous slides for the imports. Now we add a single factor with emissions per industry, and we have the import coefficient. Again, same interpretation of Leontief inverse. What I said on the previous presentation for imports now goes for exports. And the end is that this is a scalar. It's a row vector times a matrix times a column vector. Yields a scalar. It's 23.4 or whatever. So this gives the total amount of emissions in China that is embodied in the final demand vector, domestic final demand. And here, the total amount of emissions in China in the export. We calculated it, and it turned out almost 700 million tons of CO2 were in the exports. So that is 20%. And we found similar numbers for sulfur dioxide and NOx, also 21%. And the question, of course, is that much? So at that time, there was one other study that did similar calculations. They found 21% in 2002, very comparable to our 20%, but they had additional data, they found 33% in 2005. So that was for us very alarming. Whoa, that's we're talking here about possibly big business. I'm not talking about peanuts. Now we get the whole story again. It's about not being able to see what we want to see. So again, we're going to use this tripartite three partitioning of industry types, domestic use only, processing exports, and non-processing exports and other production of foreign invested enterprises. We use the same table. And whereas we had lambda prime, Leontief inverse, final demand plus exports, we have here, so I can calculate the total amount of emissions, if I leave out this, total amount of emissions in China for only final demand for domestic use only, the non-processing export, sorry, the domestic use by this category, the processing export, and the non-processing exports. And here are, oh no, not yet. What we did not have was, again, what we did not have is emission coefficients for these three categories. So we said we have to make an assumption. And we made a ridiculous assumption. We assumed that these coefficients, emission coefficients, were roughly the same. Exactly the same. We made another assumption, which is ridiculous, and we think that the truth is somewhere in between. We said, well, processing exports is basically fly in the products, have a little play with the screwdriver, and out go the exports. There's hardly any emissions involved. We said, okay, because processing exports uses little domestic production, little domestic activity, and therefore a little amount of emissions. So therefore, we assumed here in the category separate coefficients, separate emission coefficient, that the emissions are proportional to the use of domestic inputs. And for the D category, they use a lot of domestic inputs, so there's also a lot of emissions. And for the processing export, they use very little domestic inputs. So there, the emission coefficients are little. And here are the results. these are the numbers that we had before. These are the numbers that we have now. So the exports of all the emissions, 13% of the emissions go into the exports, 11% to non-processing exports, and 2% to processing exports. Same for the domestic point of views. This 20% is the 23% that we used before. And this 13% actually is 12.6%. Observe that this is a huge difference. It means that the CO2 emissions in the export are overestimated by 61%. And that is caused only by not taking into account the special characteristics of the tripartite industrial table, special characteristics of processing. It's nothing else, because as you can see, well, this is an error of 61%. It sounds a lot, but who cares whether it's 20 or 13%? I mean, it's a little different. In that case, you should realize that this measurement error has the size of the total emission of the Netherlands or a country like Poland. And well, I mean, if you want to call the Netherlands a measurement error, fine with me, but Polish people don't call them measurement errors. So it's only by these not taking into account this special characteristics. But here you see that the difference between two extreme assumptions for emission coefficients, it doesn't make much difference. It doesn't make much difference. So that is not where the issue is. So the conclusion is that the exports, 55% of all exports, and the emissions due to processing export are only 1/6 of the all export related emissions. The processing exports are relatively very clean in comparison to the non-processing exports. Yes, that's true, but you also earn very little money on these processing exports. So we checked value added, and yes, that's true. Value added processing exports are 23% of all export related value added. So still, it's true. Processing export generate less value added than non-processing export, but relatively even lesser emissions. So in terms of emissions, we also check the emissions to value added. So for every 1,000 renminbi of value added created by processing exports, there are 0.19 tons of CO2, and for the ordinary exports, it's 0.29. So stimulating processing trades, processing export is good for Chinese environmental management. And then the referee said, who cares? We don't care. Because what about global emissions? That's what we are interested in. Not so much the Chinese emissions, but the global emissions. So it is not necessarily the case that the authority is about global emissions, unless ordinary exports depend on, for example, coal-based power plants in China, which is the case. So in that case, ordinary exports depend on Chinese electricity, but your processing exports may depend on Japanese electricity, which is relatively clean because based on nuclear power. So in that case, it's also the case that replacing Chinese ordinary exports by processing exports reduces the global emissions. And that apparently was convincing argument. So the policy discussions of the central policy message, policy discussions should be based on the right information. So, and neglecting specific features of this processing trait led to a serious overestimation of 61%. So this is the starting point, and the answer is less than you think. And we thought that the Chinese government would keep with this message, but apparently they didn't care so much. At least my co-authors are still alive. I think this is the last one, and I believe it's a very short one. So this is about China's emergence as the world factory. But then what does it do to their national income? Because that's slightly different before. So here we have what does it say? All right. So how much did China earn from its exports? Well, this was the idea of processing trade, processing export, assembly work using cheap labor, so they don't earn very much from these processing exports. That's what we've seen. And so the Chinese policy was we must do better. So they started a policy of upgrading their production process. And they were reasonably successful. So this is the domestic value added that is in the exports. It's the counterpart of the imports that go into the export. So foreigners, they earn 446 on every 1,000 renminbi of Chinese exports. In 2007, it was already 592. These numbers were in constant prices, so they're comparable. So the increase was 38 renminbi per 1,000. So that was not extremely much, but it was at least a starting point and starts step forward. But then we realized that, okay, China started pushing to produce more with domestic inputs. So what we see is that the processing exports depend less on imports and slightly more on domestic inputs. And that was a deliberate policy choice. But we also saw that a lot of this was financed by American firms and European firms, implying that a lot of these gains went back to the US and went back to Europe. So the question is, yes, China earns more in terms of GDP, but how much remains in the country? And that turned out to be relatively less. So that was only 7. So out of these extra earnings, we're doing better. Only 18% remain as income in the country. So 82% of these extra earnings went abroad. So it did not help China very much. Afterwards, mentioned that this number is on the lower side. And 2002 was relatively high. Perhaps this was a particular special situation, and it improved slowly. But be careful by stating a policy that we must upgrade, and it's always by definition good for us well, you see, it's not always by definition. So there are some second thoughts. So in China, things are getting slowly better. I think that was my last slide. This means that in 2 days, on Wednesday, we start conquering the world.
Entonces, agradecemos a todos los que nos acompañaron aquí ahora sí que en el salón y a todos los que están vía streaming. Nos vemos el próximo miércoles, igual a las 10 de la mañana, para continuar con el curso. A las 10 de la mañana. Y bueno, todos están invitados también para, si gustan, a las 5 de la tarde del día de hoy, se le dará la cátedra Torres Gaitán al doctor Eric Ditzenbacher. Entonces, si gustan acompañarnos, son bienvenidos todos. Pues muchas gracias a todos y nos vemos entonces el miércoles. Gracias. Thank you.